mocked him from the moment he was born, called him a bastard, a stain, a mistake, not a prince, not a rightful heir, just the son of a tanner's daughter and a duke who died too soon. And yet, this boy, this unwanted thing, watched them all. Listened, waited, and when the world turned its back, he sharpened himself into something else, not a man, but a blade, one that would one day slit the throat of an entire kingdom. He did not inherit power. He took it first with silence, then with steel. While other children played with sticks, William was learning which men could be bought, which could be broken, and which had to be bled dry. By the time he was old enough to ride a horse, his hands had already tasted rebellion, betrayal, and the blood of his own nobles. And when the throne of England slipped through his grasp, claimed by a man he once called ally, William did not weep. He did not kneel. He built a fleet, raised a holy banner, and crossed the sea with one intention: to crush Harold Godwinson beneath a mountain of corpses and flame. And he did. He split England open and crowned himself on the ashes. But William didn't stop at victory. He didn't know how. The conqueror who rose from bastardy didn't just want a crown, he wanted obedience, terror, permanence. So he burned the north. He starved his enemies. He watched as peasants wept beside frozen children, and he wrote it all down, not out of shame, but pride. Long after he died, his bloodline continued the war he started. And centuries later, a prince with his same ruthless blood would ride again, this time across France, cutting down men by the thousands, rotting alive before he could ever wear the crown he deserved. William was the beginning. The Black Prince, just the echo. But long before England learned to fear the name Plantagenet, it had already bled for the bastard of Normandy. Before there was a crown, there was a boy in Falaise, and the first thing he learned was how to survive. He was born without a crown, without a name men respected, only a sneer that followed him wherever he went, the bastard of Falaise. In a castle that stank of damp stone and political rot, a boy grew up knowing that his blood was unclean. His mother, Herleva, was no lady, just a tanner's daughter with calloused hands and the wrong scent. His father, Duke Robert of Normandy, loved him, but love is worthless when you're dead, and Robert didn't live long enough to shield him from what came next. When William was just 7, the wolves descended. They didn't come with teeth. They came with rings and titles and smiles that meant murder. Every man who bowed in court did so while sharpening a knife behind his back. One by one, William's protectors were assassinated, loyalists slaughtered, and the boy himself hunted like diseased game. He learned to sleep in armor, to listen for footsteps in the dark, to speak less so no one could twist his words. By the time he reached adolescence, William didn't trust priests, didn't trust knights, didn't trust blood. Only fear. Fear kept him alive, and he began to wonder what if he could reverse it. They called him bastard, so he made the word sacred. Every cut, every insult, every coward who tried to unseat him, he wore them like iron across his skin. And when his voice broke into manhood, it didn't tremble, it commanded. Behind his eyes wasn't the innocence of youth, but the calm calculation of someone who'd already survived his own execution 10 times over. He didn't see Normandy as a duchy to govern. He saw it as a battlefield yet to be claimed. What they didn't realize, what they never understood until it was too late, was that William had never been just a boy fighting to stay alive. He had been preparing, Every humiliation sharpened him. Every betrayal trained him. Every noble who had once tried to end him would soon kneel or burn. By the time Normandy finally called him Duke, William was no longer proving that he deserved the title. He was making sure no one else would ever survive long enough to challenge it, and it would start with the first to defy him. They thought they could control him, that once he was named Duke, the boy they'd tried to kill would become their puppet. But William had spent too long in the shadows to ever bow to men who once hunted him. The moment he gripped power, he didn't celebrate, he retaliated. One by one, the Norman barons who had mocked him, schemed against him, or merely hesitated to kneel were broken, not in battle, in message. William didn't just crush rebellion, he made it scream. He dragged dissenters from their halls and made examples of them. Some were hanged in their own courtyards, left twisting in front of their weeping wives. Others were blinded and left in the woods like rotting trophies. He didn't just want their deaths, he wanted their sons to inherit fear. The blood that soaked Norman soil was no longer from conquest, it was from correction. And every lord left standing began to whisper the same thing behind sealed doors. This is no longer a boy. This is something else. But fear alone wasn't enough. William began reshaping the very structure of power in Normandy. He stripped old families of land, replaced them with loyal beasts, and built alliances not through marriage or courtesy, but through leverage and intimidation. He understood that loyalty born of love was fragile, but loyalty born of terror, that endured. Still, the deeper twist wasn't how brutal he was, it was how efficient. William wasn't ruled by rage, he never lost control. His executions weren't personal, they were systematic. He turned Normandy into a theater of obedience. When he passed through towns, silence followed. Mothers quieted their children at the mention of his name. Priests chose their prayers carefully. Even the church, which once hesitated to crown a bastard, now kissed his hand. By his early 20s, William had turned the duchy that once tried to erase him into a machine that obeyed his every command. But the hunger didn't fade. Normandy had bent, but the world hadn't. And the crown across the sea, the one worn by a dying king with no heir, that crown began to call to him. What William saw in England wasn't just opportunity, it was destiny. He had mastered Normandy, but power once tasted doesn't settle, it festers. And William's eyes turned outward across the channel toward a kingdom fraying at the seams, England. Its king, Edward the Confessor, was aging, childless, and surrounded by vultures. But William didn't see crisis. He saw inheritance, the kind you don't wait for, the kind you hunt down and take by force. He claimed Edward had promised him the throne. Maybe he had, maybe he hadn't. William didn't care. He understood that truth was irrelevant when it could be buried beneath ceremony, ritual, and steel. What mattered was the story and who was left to tell it. And so William began constructing his narrative, that he was the rightful heir, the guardian of God's will, the man destined to rule both Normandy and England. But beneath that claim pulsed the same darkness that had guided him since childhood. He didn't want a throne because it was owed. He wanted it because someone else had it. William studied England like a butcher studies a carcass. He knew the factions, the loyalties, the weak points. He sent envoys, cultivated spies, quietly built alliances with disaffected nobles. And when Harold Godwinson, his supposed ally, was shipwrecked on Norman shores, William did not greet him with hospitality. He greeted him with a trap. Harold was treated well, too well. He feasted, hunted, rode beside William like a brother, but the wine was too sweet, the smiles too perfect. And then came the moment. William placed ancient holy relics before Harold and demanded an oath, one sworn in the name of God, that Harold would support his claim to the English throne. Harold hesitated, William pressed, and in that silence, Harold broke. He swore the oath, he kissed the relics, and somewhere behind William's eyes, the predator smiled, because whether or not Harold meant to keep it didn't matter. Now, if he broke it, William wouldn't just be a rival, he'd be an avenger. A holy executioner. That single oath would ignite one of the bloodiest invasions England had ever seen. And William knew it. He wasn't asking for loyalty, he was loading a weapon. By the time Harold sailed back to England, William was already preparing. Because when you bait a traitor, you don't wait for him to strike, you strike first. When Harold Godwinson placed England's crown on his head, William didn't flinch, he calculated. The oath had been broken, publicly and brazenly, but William didn't storm into a rage. He didn't rant. He simply began preparing for war. Because for a man like William, betrayal wasn't an insult. It was an invitation, an excuse, a signal to unleash everything he'd spent decades building. He sent letters first, not to England, but to Rome. While Harold fortified his borders, William was already burrowing beneath them, whispering to the Pope that the English crown had been seized by a liar, a man who had spat on sacred relics. William, meanwhile, cast himself not as a warlord, but as a righteous claimant wronged. And while swords were being forged, so was a new image, not William the bastard, but William the anointed. But he didn't rely on prayers alone. Normandy became a hive of motion. Armor clanged, ships were built, alliances secured. William offered land, gold, promises of spoils to mercenaries and barons across Europe. Men came not out of loyalty, but hunger. That was fine. He didn't need love, he needed numbers. And with every passing week, his army grew not just in size, but in faith. This would not be an invasion, William told them. It would be a crusade. And still, he waited. Because William knew that timing would carve the battlefield. When the winds finally shifted in his favor, his fleet surged toward England like a second tide. But the true war had started long before boots hit soil. It started the moment Harold swore on relics and William chose to remember. When his army landed at Pevensey, they found little resistance. Harold was still up north, bloodied from another battle, unaware that the final reckoning was already unfolding behind him. William didn't charge forward recklessly. He fortified his position, gathered intelligence, built his defenses. The battle would come soon, but not on Harold's terms, because William hadn't crossed the sea for a skirmish. He'd come to bury a king. And to do that, he needed more than blades. He needed divine sanction, and that meant bending the Pope to his will. God may not have chosen William, but William chose to speak for God. While England braced for swords and ships, William launched a quieter campaign, one fought with parchment, relics, and illusion. In Rome, Pope Alexander II was grappling with chaos across Christendom. William saw not a spiritual leader, but a man desperate for order, and he offered him exactly that, if only he would bless a war cloaked in justice. The letters William sent weren't pleas. They were scripts. He painted Harold as a liar, a traitor who had broken sacred oaths and mocked the church by stealing a throne meant for a God-fearing man. William cast himself as the injured party, but also the solution. He promised to bring England back into spiritual alignment, to protect the church's interests, to rule not for vanity, but for divine order. It was a lie so convincing, it didn't sound like ambition, it sounded like salvation. And the Pope, in his ivory seat, blinked once and agreed. What William received wasn't just permission, it was consecration. A papal banner, white and holy, sent across Europe to bless the blood he was about to spill. And with that cloth, William's invasion became a crusade. His soldiers weren't just raiders anymore. They were God's chosen sword. And William, the bastard of Falaise, was now heaven's general. But the twist wasn't the Pope's approval. It was how little William believed in it. He didn't pray before battle. He didn't kneel. His faith wasn't in scripture, it was in strategy. The church wasn't his master, it was his mask. And through it, he convinced thousands to kill not for conquest, but for righteousness. Even those who doubted now stayed silent. After all, who would dare defy a man with a holy banner in one hand and a burning fleet in the other? By the time William marched inland, his army wasn't just armored, they were anointed. And Harold, still crowned in defiance, would soon face not just an enemy, but a myth. The ground at Hastings drank deeply. October 14th, 1066, two armies met not as rivals, but as futures colliding. On one side, Harold Godwinson, weary, bruised, dragged south after crushing another invasion just days before. On the other, William of Normandy, rested, armored, and draped in divine approval. The moment their eyes met across the battlefield, it wasn't a contest. It was a sentence being carried out. Harold's forces took the high ground, forming a shield wall, a centuries-old tactic that had never failed them. But William wasn't fighting tradition. He was fighting men, and he knew men break long before walls do. He launched cavalry charges again and again, probing, feinting, watching. When his own troops wavered, retreating in chaos, Harold's men broke rank to chase them, and that's when William struck. It wasn't a mistake, it was bait. And the moment the line fractured, the Anglo-Saxons lost more than position. They lost the battle. Then came the arrows. Some say it was random, others divine irony, but one shaft found Harold's eye. The king staggered, blinded, groping for balance. He was still alive. William made sure that didn't last long. Whether by blade or trampling hoof, Harold was torn apart at the center of his own army, his body mangled beyond recognition. His men watched their king die screaming, and then they broke. The field turned into a slaughterhouse. Anglo-Saxon resistance collapsed. Men ran not for victory, but for mercy, mercy that never came. William's cavalry chased them down like game, spears plunging into backs, horses galloping over crushed limbs and skulls. There were no survivors, only witnesses, and none of them left the field clean. But the most chilling detail wasn't the blood, it was the silence after. As the sun set over Hastings, the crown of England lay in the mud, stained, ownerless. William did not rush to pick it up. He let the wind blow through the dead. Let the weight of what he'd done settle over the land like a curse. Victory didn't soothe him, it never had. Because William hadn't crossed the sea for glory. He came to conquer, and conquest demands more than a single battle. Now came the harder part, holding the corpse of England still while he reshaped it in his image. He was crowned in fire. Christmas Day, 1066, inside Westminster Abbey, as chants filled the air, the newly crowned King of England stood draped in gold, surrounded by blades. But outside, the streets of London boiled. Norman guards, hearing shouts from within the church, mistook them for rebellion. They panicked. Torches were thrown, houses burned, civilians screamed, and William didn't stop the ceremony. He let the flames rise. Let the crown descend onto his head while the city choked on smoke. It was the perfect beginning for a reign forged not in unity, but terror. William understood one thing: England didn't want him, not truly, not the nobles, not the church, not the peasants, so he gave them no choice. Across the countryside, he stamped out resistance not with diplomacy, but with steel. He confiscated land, seized titles, gutted the English nobility, and replaced them with Norman loyalists. Castles were built like fangs across the land, hundreds of them, symbols of control, nests of soldiers, reminders that the old order was dead. But raw brutality wasn't the only tool. William wielded fear like a craftsman. When rumors of dissent surfaced, entire families disappeared. Monasteries that resisted were stripped of relics and gold. Villages harboring rebels were erased from maps, fields salted so nothing would grow. Every rebellion became a lesson. Every scream a warning. England didn't rise up, it sank down. Yet the twist wasn't the violence, it was William's detachment. He didn't gloat, he didn't rage. He punished like a surgeon cuts flesh, precise, cold, necessary. He didn't see cruelty, he saw function. And in his mind, England wasn't bleeding, it was healing by his hand, under his rule, into his shape. But there was one place that refused to bow. One region that spat in his face with the audacity of memory. The North, the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon defiance. And William didn't just want it subdued, he wanted it erased. The North didn't just resist William, it insulted him. In 1069, a rebellion sparked near York, backed by Danish invaders and fueled by Anglo-Saxon vengeance. For a brief moment, the land rose, not just in defiance, but in memory of what England had been before the bastard crossed the sea. And William snapped, not in rage, in principle. The North had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought they could rebel like it was still their kingdom. William would teach them otherwise, not by punishing fighters, but by punishing land. He marched with no mercy. Villages were razed, one after another, crops burned, wells poisoned. Entire families dragged from their homes and butchered in ditches. Those who fled into the forests were hunted like animals, stabbed in silence, left to rot beneath the trees. Winter came, and with it, famine. William sealed roads, slaughtered livestock, and watched as the survivors, mostly women and children, clawed at frozen soil for roots, bones, anything. And still he pressed on, because this wasn't war, it was correction. Horror wasn't a side effect, it was the strategy. Chroniclers called it the harrying of the North, but that name is too clean. What William committed was medieval annihilation. Over 100,000 people starved, fields turned to grave. Skeletons sat beside empty cradles. Priests wrote that the land cried out, that the devil himself would have wept. But William didn't. He called it necessary, the price of peace. And when he was done, the North didn't just fall silent, it disappeared. And yet the deeper horror was this: it worked. Rebellion died in the cold. The people obeyed, not because they believed in him, but because they feared what he might do next. That fear became the foundation of his England, but fear alone doesn't last, not forever, and William knew it. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted permanence. So he devised something darker than swords, a record, a grip that would outlive his breaths. You can't burn a country forever, but you can own it. After the North lay silent and the rebellion ceased, William didn't rest, he recalibrated. Blood had brought him the throne, but now he wanted something far more dangerous than loyalty. Structure, control that didn't require his presence, fear that didn't need fire, and so he created a weapon more enduring than any sword, the Doomsday Book. In 1085, he ordered a survey of everything. Every field, every plough, every cow, every human who owed, owned, or served. Nothing was too small, nothing was exempt. Royal commissioners moved across England like shadows, questioning villagers, monks, landowners. But these weren't census takers. They were architects of a cage. The people didn't see a ledger, they saw exposure. Every name recorded was a name that could be taxed, watched, punished. The Doomsday Book didn't simply count England, it captured it. And beneath the surface of this brilliant bureaucracy was something colder, vengeance masquerading as governance. William rewrote land ownership from the top down. If you were Norman, you were nothing. Anglo-Saxon nobles were erased, their holdings carved up and handed to his loyalists. This wasn't redistribution, it was replacement. A country with the same name, but none of the same blood. But the true twist wasn't in the pages. It was in the silence that followed. The English didn't rise again, not because they were pacified, but because they were catalogued. They had been turned from rebels into assets. The land was mapped, the people measured, and William held the keys. Even the church, which once loomed untouchable, found itself beneath his hand. Bishops were replaced, monasteries reshaped. The divine had served its purpose, and now it would kneel like everyone else. This wasn't kingship. It was domination with parchment skin. And yet, William's greatest project, the one forged in trauma, sustained through terror, and bound in ink, would end not in triumph, but in rot, because even conquerors bleed. The man who had bent kingdoms to his will died groaning in filth. In 1087, after decades of war, suppression, and ice-blooded rule, William the Conqueror was thrown from his horse during a siege in France. His swollen frame ruptured internally. Infection set in. He was dragged, groaning, to the priory of St. Gervais. There, the King of England and Duke of Normandy, once draped in gold and silence, lay stinking, gasping, surrounded not by loyal lords, but by servants waiting to rob him. As his fever climbed, his breath rattled. He confessed his sins, not out of regret, but calculation. Perhaps even in death, he believed confession could be wielded like a weapon, but there was no dignity. When he finally stopped breathing, his attendants abandoned him. His corpse was stripped of valuables. Even his sons, too consumed by their own ambition, left the body to rot unattended. But the horror hadn't reached its peak. When monks came to bury him, they found the tomb too small. William's bloated corpse, swollen with rot and gases, refused to fit. The monks pushed, forced, something tore. his abdomen split open. Hot putrid stench exploded into the church, causing onlookers to stagger back, choking, retching. The room fell into chaos, and in that moment, the conqueror, the man who had carved history into bone, became a spectacle of decay. No hymns, no mourning masses echoing through kingdoms, just a corpse, distended and leaking, dropped into a stone hole too narrow for the body it once feared. A final, monstrous irony. The man who reshaped nations couldn't even fit inside his own grave. And yet, his legacy did not rot. The terror he sowed, the architecture of fear he left behind it endured. Every monarch that followed ruled in his shadow. Every revolt remembered his fire. And centuries later, as his bloodline burned through Europe, one prince in particular would carry that same shadow into France. They called him the Black Prince, a warrior born of conquest, molded in pain, and dead before his crown could even touch his brow. William was not merely a king, he was a transformation. The moment England stopped belonging to the English, the moment power stopped asking permission, the moment bloodlines turned to empire, and when he died, he did not take his terror with him. He left it behind. If Harold Godwinson was the last man to die for the Old England, then William was the man who made sure it never came back. One died with an arrow in his eye, the other died with his guts exploding inside a stone church. Two ends of the same crown, one broken by fate, the other by fire. But the story doesn't end in 1066. William's shadow stretched far beyond Hastings. It infected the throne, soaked into the soil, and festered in the blood of those who came after. Centuries later, that same bloodline, sharpened through generations of war, would ride again. A prince cloaked in black would bring France to its knees and rot from the inside before ever touching the throne meant for him. You've seen the fall of Harold. You've seen the rise of William. Now witness the storm they left behind. Watch Harold Godwinson, the last Saxon king who died screaming, and the Black Prince, England's blood prince who rotted before his crown, because the past doesn't die. It just waits for the next to bleed.